At 9:47 on the morning of July 7, 1944, Captain George Hunt pressed his shoulder against the rough coral ridge on Saipan and raised his field glasses just long enough to steady his breathing. In front of him, a mortarman dropped a 3-pound high-explosive round down the narrow tube of a 60mm mortar. The shell vanished, struck the fixed firing pin, and leapt skyward with a flat, metallic thump. It was a weapon Hunt's own battalion commander had dismissed months earlier as too light to matter, something barely worth carrying when heavier guns existed. Now, at 26 years old, Hunt commanded Company K of the 3rd Battalion, 1st Marines, 235 men and 3 mortars whose combined weight was less than a single jeep, standing between the American line and annihilation. Across the open wasteland of Paradise Valley, more than 4,000 Japanese soldiers had finished their final cups of sake. They stood assembling into formation, officers waving swords, voices rising together in ritual death chants that rolled across the coral and could be heard miles away. It was the largest banzai charge the Pacific War would ever see. Hunt's mortars could reach targets nearly 1,800 yards away, but that morning they were set to fire at 50 yards. Danger close range. Close enough that the blasts would rip apart anything standing in a space no larger than a football field directly in front of American foxholes. For 2 years, American officers had argued over the 60mm mortar. Was it real artillery or just an expensive toy? It weighed 42 pounds, fired shells no larger than soup cans, and demanded a 5-man crew to keep it working. Marines called it pocket artillery, light enough to carry forward, powerful enough to put explosives exactly where rifles and machine guns could not. Japanese commanders, trained in doctrines of spiritual superiority and night assaults, believed American soldiers would panic when faced with screaming masses charging headlong through darkness. Both sides were about to learn which belief would survive contact with reality. Hunt adjusted his glasses and watched the first Japanese figures emerge from the tree-line, bayonets glinting, officers raising swords, the chant of "Tenno Hika Banzai" rolling like thunder across the coral. His mortar crews did not look up. They had plotted every firing solution days earlier. Elevation, deflection, charge, and rate of fire had been calculated with mathematical precision to build an unbroken wall of steel exactly where the attackers would have to cross. The Japanese believed the human spirit could overcome any obstacle. The Americans believed in 3 pounds of high explosive delivered on target every 3 seconds for as long as ammunition held out. What followed would rewrite tactical manuals and leave survivors so shaken that mass charges would never again seem glorious. Hours earlier, just after midnight, the rain had stopped, but northern Saipan still dripped with moisture. Every step along the coral ridges echoed like a rifle shot. Lieutenant Colonel William O'Brien moved methodically along his forward positions, checking ammunition stacks and fields of fire. He had learned through hard experience that small details decided whether men lived or died. His 1st Battalion, 105th Infantry, held a 2,000-yard front across the Tanapag Plain, anchored on low ridges that gave machine gunners clean lines of sight over the coastal flats where Japanese forces had been gathering since sunset. At a mortar pit, O'Brien paused. 3 Marines were cleaning their stubby 60mm M2 mortar, a short tube on a bipod that looked more like an oversized drain pipe than artillery. It weighed 42 pounds, light enough for 2 men to carry, heavy enough that infantry still cursed it on long marches. Staff Sergeant Mike Koslowski looked up and nodded toward the darkness. The Japanese had been singing and shouting for hours. Something big was coming. The mortar had entered the Pacific almost as an afterthought, borrowed from a French design of the previous war. American ordnance officers adopted it reluctantly when they realized rifle companies needed their own artillery. Edgar Brandt's design was simple and reliable. Crews dropped shells down the tube and let gravity and physics do the work. It could fire 18 rounds per minute and throw a 3-pound explosive nearly 1,800 yards. Doctrine called for 3 mortars per rifle company, but combat scattered them wherever commanders needed fire the fastest. O'Brien had learned their value months earlier on Mount Austin. Watching shells drop into dead ground rifles could never touch. The mortars could fire danger close missions heavier artillery could not risk, shells landing 50 yards in front of friendly lines without killing the men who called for them. As chanting swelled into thousands of voices, Japanese soldiers prepared for what they called Gyokusai, honorable death. General Yoshitsugu Sato's order was absolute. Every man who could walk would attack. The wounded would die where they lay. Sake flowed freely. Officers gave speeches about eternal honor. Infantry, sailors, rear area personnel, and civilians armed with bamboo spears would all go forward together. Against this, American defenses were methodical. Cleared fields of fire stretched 60 to 100 yards. Barbed wire funneled attackers into kill zones. Every weapon was registered in advance. Mortar crews had walked their rounds by daylight, memorizing impact points until firing in darkness became instinct. Ammunition was stacked neatly. High explosive, white phosphorus, illumination. Over 200 rounds had already been fired just in preparation. At 4:30 a.m., Japanese artillery began falling, the heaviest barrage since the landings. Shells searched for command posts and heavy weapons, then lifted as infantry began moving. The sound came first, a low rumble that became a roar as thousands of voices shouted together. When O'Brien gave the order to fire, every American weapon opened at once. Machine guns swept pre-planned arcs. Rifles picked targets. And the mortars began their steady, murderous rhythm, turning the narrow strip of ground ahead of the wire into a storm of steel. The same lesson had been learned nearly 2 years earlier on Guadalcanal. On October 24, 1942, Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Puller crouched in a foxhole along Bloody Ridge, listening to machetes cutting through jungle as Japanese troops assembled. His Marines faced coordinated night assaults designed to overwhelm defenses before heavy weapons could respond. But Puller's battalion had reorganized. Each rifle company had mortars, machine guns, and integrated fire plans. Mortar crews had memorized firing data for every approach. When Japanese infantry charged, screaming into the darkness, they met interlocking fire instead of panic. The 60mm mortars fired nearly 20 rounds per minute, saturating jungle approaches, landing behind cover, exposing every movement under illumination. By dawn, thousands of Japanese lay dead. Marine losses were minimal. The lesson was clear. Massed infantry assaults against prepared firepower were obsolete. On Saipan, that lesson was enforced on an even larger scale. The first wave of Japanese infantry advanced with discipline, using shell craters and coral ridges, but mortars walked shells through their formations, forcing them into machine gun lanes. Illumination rounds turned night into flickering day. The second wave came as a human mass: naval troops, wounded men, volunteers with sharpened tools and bamboo spears. They reached within 50 yards before mortars shifted to final protective fire. Shells landed so close Americans felt the blast pressure, but the overlapping bursts created an unbroken belt of fragmentation. Mortar tubes glowed with heat. Ammunition bearers ran non-stop. The third wave was everyone left alive. Men barely able to walk screamed and carried family photos as they charged. O'Brien shifted ammunition to the mortars, knowing they were the key. When attackers breached the wire, mortars fired at minimum range, shells landing within 30 yards. It was brutal, industrial killing. By sunrise on July 7th, Paradise Valley was carpeted with bodies. Over 4,000 Japanese soldiers lay dead in that sector alone. O'Brien's battalion had lost hundreds, but it still stood. The mortars had fired more than 3,000 rounds in 6 hours. The doctrine of massed assault had become nothing more than compulsory suicide. Months later, on Peleliu, Captain George Hunt learned the same lesson from the opposite side of the equation. His company seized a narrow coral point only to find itself surrounded. Japanese forces occupied caves and ridges on 3 sides. There was no rear, no covered resupply route. Hunt's 360mm mortars became his lifeline. Positioned in shallow coral pits, they fired almost continuously, arcing shells over friendly lines into ravines and cave mouths rifles could not reach. Ammunition ran low. Tubes overheated. Japanese counterattacks came in waves, infiltrating through caves, reaching within yards. Mortar crews fired at point-blank range, shells landing 20 yards away, while Marines fought hand-to-hand around the pits. By dawn, Company K had been reduced to 78 men. Over 400 Japanese lay dead nearby. The mortars had fired more than 800 rounds. Pocket artillery had replaced battalion fire support because nothing else could reach them. By 1945, Japanese commanders understood the truth. Colonel Hiromichi Yahara on Okinawa studied reports showing that American companies possessed more effective artillery than entire Japanese divisions. Mortars, machine guns, artillery, naval gunfire, and air support were integrated into killing systems that reduced courage to irrelevance. Yahara argued for attritional defense from caves and reverse slopes, abandoning mass assaults entirely. American industrial power had transformed warfare. 60mm mortars were no longer support weapons. They were decisive tools, symbols of a system where firepower replaced doctrine built on spirit alone. By the war's end, tens of thousands of mortars and millions of shells ensured every American company could bring artillery wherever it went. The human cost was staggering. On Okinawa alone, Japanese dead exceeded 90,000. The tactical truth was undeniable. Against prepared firepower, mass infantry attacks were not brave. They were meaningless. And in the narrow strip of coral in front of Captain George Hunt's foxholes, the steady thump of a small mortar had proven it beyond argument.